Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises, or are you, like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us, just beyond the veil of sleep. But before we dive into their world, let me paint you a picture of what we're really talking about here. We're not just exploring some footnote in Egyptian history. We're uncovering a sophisticated network of women who advised pharaohs on military strategy, influenced religious policy, and accumulated wealth that rivaled the treasuries of entire provinces. Some of these women became so powerful that their names were deliberately erased from official records, their stories buried beneath centuries of sand and silence. What you're about to discover will completely change you. Think how about ancient Egypt? Forget everything you thought you knew about the role of women in pharaonic society. The courtesans of Thebes weren't just entertainers or companions. They were kingmakers, spies, diplomats, and sometimes the real rulers behind the golden mask. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to 3 specific women whose stories will blow your mind. First, there's Kamwaset, a courtesan who rose from the streets of Thebes to become the unofficial advisor to Ramesses II during his most critical military campaigns. Then we'll meet Isetemkeb, whose beauty was so legendary that it sparked a civil war between 2 rival pharaohs, and whose political maneuvering ultimately decided which dynasty would rule Egypt for the next 2 centuries. Finally, I'll tell you about Taweret, a courtesan who built a spy network so extensive that she knew about foreign invasions weeks before the pharaoh's own generals. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. These women didn't just accumulate power through seduction or manipulation. They were educated, often more literate than the nobles around them, fluent in multiple languages, and skilled in everything from astronomy to medicine. They had to be, because surviving in the dangerous world of pharaonic politics required intelligence that went far beyond physical beauty. The story begins in the heart of Thebes, during the height of the New Kingdom, when Egypt controlled an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. Picture the capital city at sunset, when the Nile reflected gold and crimson, and the massive temples cast long shadows across streets filled with merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims from across the known world. It was in this bustling metropolis that Kamwaset first caught the attention of the royal court. Born in the workers' quarter near the Valley of the Kings, she was the daughter of a tomb painter whose modest skills barely kept food on the table. But Kamwaset possessed something that couldn't be bought or inherited. She had a mind that absorbed information like papyrus soaks up ink, and a voice that could make grown men weep or laugh with equal ease. By the time she reached her 16th year, Kamwaset had already mastered hieratic script, learned to speak Akkadian from Mesopotamian traders, and memorized vast portions of religious texts that most priests struggled to recite correctly. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her intellect that set her apart from every other young woman in Thebes. The opportunity that would change her life forever came during the festival of Opet, when Pharaoh Ramesses II made his ceremonial journey from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple. As the golden barge carrying the sacred statue of Amun floated down the Nile, accompanied by thousands of cheering citizens, Kamwaset found herself standing in the crowd next to a nervous young scribe from the royal administration. This scribe, whose name's Amenhotep, had been tasked with recording the festival proceedings for the royal archives. But in the excitement he had forgotten the propered chaos of the celebration's ceremonial formulas and was frantically trying to remember the correct phrases. Kamwaset, overhearing his distress, quietly whispered the missing passages to him, word for word, in perfect hieratic. Amenhotep was astounded. Here was a young woman from the common quarters who knew religious texts better than trained scribes. When he reported this encounter to his superiors, word eventually reached the ears of someone very important indeed. Within a week, Khaemwaset received a summons that would terrify most people in her position. She was to appear before Khaemwaset the Elder, the pharaoh's chief concubine, and the unofficial leader of the royal women's quarters. Now, Khaemwaset the Elder was no ordinary court figure. She had been Ramesses' companion for over 20 years, had borne him 3 sons, and had accumulated political influence that extended far beyond the palace walls. She was known throughout Egypt for her sharp intelligence and her ability to spot talent in the most unlikely places. When she looked at the young woman who shared her name, she saw potential that could be shaped into something extraordinary. The meeting took place in the Garden of Isis, a private courtyard within the royal palace, where exotic flowers bloomed year-round and fountains created a peaceful sanctuary away from the constant bustle of court life. Khaemwaset the Younger, as she would later be known, entered this paradise wearing her finest dress, which was still humble by palace standards. Her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. But Khaemwaset the Elder didn't begin with questions about beauty or charm, or the usual concerns of the royal household. Instead, she asked the young woman to recite the genealogy of the Pharaohs, to explain the significance of various religious festivals, and to translate several passages from Akkadian into Egyptian. For 3 hours they talked about politics, religion, literature, and the complex diplomatic relationships that held Egypt's empire together. By the end of that conversation, both women knew that something remarkable was about to begin. Khaemwaset the Younger would enter the royal household, not as a simple concubine or entertainer, but as a protégé being groomed for something far more significant. Her education would continue under the guidance of the palace's finest teachers, but more importantly, she would learn the subtle arts of influence and persuasion that could shape the decisions of the most powerful man in the ancient world. The transformation that followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Within 6 months, Khaemwaset had mastered the complex etiquette of court life, learned to read people's intentions from the slightest gesture or expression, and developed AI that extended throughout network of contacts, the palace hierarchy. She studied military strategy with retired generals, learned diplomatic protocols from seasoned ambassadors, and absorbed the intricacies of Egyptian theology from the high priests of Thebes. But her real education came from observing Ramesses himself during the private audiences, where she was increasingly present. She learned to recognize when the pharaoh was genuinely interested in a proposal versus when he was simply being polite. She discovered which advisors he truly trusted and which ones he tolerated out of political necessity. Most importantly, she began to understand the immense burden of ruling an empire, the constant pressure of making decisions that could affect millions of lives. It was during the crisis of the Hittite invasion threat that Khaemwaset first demonstrated the full extent of her capabilities. Intelligence reports had reached Thebes suggesting that the Hittite king was massing troops near the Egyptian border in Syria. But the information was contradictory and confusing. Some spies reported massive military preparations, while others insisted that the Hittites were actually dealing with internal rebellions and posed no immediate threat. The Pharaoh's council was divided. His military commanders urged immediate mobilization of Egypt's army, arguing that any delay could prove catastrophic. His diplomatic advisors counseled patience, worried that premature military action could destroy years of careful negotiations with neighboring kingdoms. The debate raged for days, with tempers growing shorter and positions becoming more entrenched. It was Khaemwaset who suggested a solution that no one else had considered. Rather than relying solely on Egyptian spies who might be compromised or misinformed, why not use the extensive network of merchants and traders who regularly traveled the routes between Egypt and Hittite territory? These men had no political loyalties to either side, but they had keen eyes for the kind of practical details that could reveal the true situation. More importantly, Camwaset had been cultivating relationships with several of these merchant princes for months, learning their languages, understanding their concerns, and earning their trust. She proposed that she personally meet with 3 key traders who were due to arrive in Thebes within the week, not as an official representative of the pharaoh, but as a knowledgeable woman interested in purchasing luxury goods from their travels. The plan worked brilliantly. Through seemingly casual conversations about trade routes and market conditions, Camwaset learned that the Hittites were indeed preparing for military action, but not against Egypt. They were planning to crush a rebellion in their eastern provinces, and the troop movements that had alarmed Egyptian spies were actually armies being repositioned for an entirely different campaign. This intelligence allowed Rameses to avoid a costly and unnecessary military mobilization, while simultaneously positioning Egypt to take advantage of Hittite distraction by strengthening defenses in other vulnerable areas. The success of this operation established Camwaset as far more than just another member of the royal household. She a thinker, and a valuable proven herself as a strategic intelligence asset. But her rise to prominence also created enemies within the court. Several established advisors resented the influence of someone they saw as an upstart from the common quarters, regardless of her abilities. Palace gossips whispered that she was using improper means to maintain the pharaoh's attention, spreading rumors designed to undermine her credibility and position. The most dangerous of these enemies was Ptahhotep, a nobleman whose family had served the royal court for generations and who considered himself the rightful heir to greater influence. Ptahhotep had watched with growing alarm as this young courtesan gained access to councils, conversations that he felt should be reserved for men of proper breeding and established position. He began a subtle campaign to discredit Camwaset, spreading whispers about her humble origins and questioning whether someone from the workers' quarter could truly understand the complexities of governing an empire. More dangerously, he started suggesting that her success in gathering intelligence about the Hittites might indicate connections that went beyond mere merchant relationships. The accusations hung in the palace air, like incense smoke, poisonous and persistent. Ptahhotep's whispered campaigns began to find receptive ears among courtiers, who had never fully accepted a woman of common birth wielding such influence. But what Ptahhotep didn't realize was that his subtle warfare had been noticed by someone far more dangerous than he could imagine. Camwaset had learned to navigate palace intrigue with the same precision that Egyptian astronomers used to track the movements of stars. She knew that responding directly to Ptahhotep's attacks would only legitimize his accusations and draw unwanted attention to the very position she had worked so hard to build. Instead, she chose a strategy that would demonstrate just how thoroughly she understood the true nature of power in ancient Egypt. The opportunity came during the annual taxation review, when regional governors traveled to Thebes to report on grain harvests, gold production, and tribute collections from throughout the empire. This was always a tense time, as governors competed to present their provinces in the most favorable light, while simultaneously downplaying any problems that might reflect poorly on their administration. Camwaset had been quietly observing these proceedings for months, noting discrepancies between official reports and the information she gathered from her merchant contacts. She discovered that several governors were systematically underreporting their tax collections, skimming substantial amounts for their personal treasuries, while claiming that poor harvests or local difficulties had reduced their province's contributions to the royal coffers. But rather than expose these irregularities directly, Camwaset devised a plan that would simultaneously demonstrate her value to Rameses while neutralizing Ptahhotep's influence forever. She began by approaching the pharaoh with a seemingly innocent suggestion about improving the accuracy of provincial reports by cross-referencing them with independent merchant accounts. The beauty of her approach was that it appeared to be motivated purely by concern for the kingdom's financial health, with no personal agenda whatsoever. When Rameses agreed to implement her suggestion, the results were devastating for the corrupt governors and, more importantly, for Ptahhotep himself. You see, Ptahhotep's own family estates were located in one of the provinces where tax evasion had been most systematic. His younger brother served as deputy administrator for the region, and family correspondence that was routinely reviewed by palace security revealed detailed knowledge of the underreporting schemes. Suddenly, Ptahhotep found himself in the impossible position of either denouncing his own family or being implicated in corruption that threatened the stability of the entire empire. The scandal that followed destroyed not just Ptahhotep's political ambitions, but the credibility of everyone who had supported his attacks on Khamwaset. The woman he had dismissed as an unworthy upstart had outmaneuvered him so completely that his own allies began distancing themselves, terrified of being associated with his disgrace. But Khamwaset's triumph came with an unexpected consequence that would define the rest of her extraordinary career. Word of her strategic brilliance spread beyond the borders of Egypt, carried by diplomats and traders who witnessed the destruction of one of Thebes' most established noble families. Foreign courts began to take notice of this remarkable woman who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to gather information and manipulate political situations. It was this reputation that brought her to the attention of Muwatalli, the Hittite king whose military movements she had correctly analyzed months earlier. But instead of viewing her as an enemy, Muwatalli recognized in Khamwaset a potential asset whose skills could be valuable to his own ambitions. Through intermediaries, he began to probe whether Egypt's most famous courtesan might be interested in expanding her influence beyond the borders of her homeland. The approach was subtle and sophisticated, befitting the diplomatic traditions of two great civilizations that had been dancing around each other for generations. Rather than crude attempts at bribery or coercion, Muwatalli's representatives offered something far more tempting to a woman of Khamwaset's intelligence: access to information and perspectives that no Egyptian, regardless of rank, could obtain through conventional channels. They proposed a relationship that would benefit both kingdoms, where Khamwaset could serve as an unofficial channel for communication between the pharaoh and the Hittite king. Such arrangements were not uncommon in the ancient world, where formal diplomatic protocols often proved too rigid for the delicate negotiations required to maintain peace between powerful empires. For Khamwaset, the proposition represented an opportunity to elevate her influence to an entirely new level. No longer would she be confined to the internal politics of Egypt, however sophisticated and challenging they might be. She could become a player on the international stage, helping to shape relationships between civilizations that controlled the destiny of millions of people. But accepting the Hittite overtures also carried enormous risks. If her role as an intermediary were ever discovered by Egyptian officials who weren't privy to the arrangement, she could be accused of treason and face execution. Even Rameses himself might find it politically necessary to disavow her activities if they became public knowledge at an inconvenient moment. The decision required careful consideration of factors that went far beyond personal ambition. Khamwaset had to evaluate whether she could maintain the delicate balance required to serve Egypt's interests while appearing to cooperate with foreign powers. She had to assess whether Rameses would support such an arrangement if it were ever exposed, and whether the potential benefits justified the catastrophic consequences of failure. After weeks of careful deliberation, Khamwaset made the choice that would transform her from a palace courtesan into one of the most influential women in the ancient world. She agreed to serve as a secret diplomatic channel between Egypt and the Hittite Empire, but with conditions that protected both her position and her homeland's interests. The first secret meeting took place in a location that perfectly symbolized the dangerous game she had chosen to play. The island of Elephantine, at the first cataract of the Nile, marked the traditional boundary between Egypt proper and the Nubian territories to the south. It was a place where different worlds met, where Egyptian authority blended with foreign influences, where merchants and diplomats from dozens of different kingdoms gathered to trade goods and information. Khamwaset traveled to Elephantine as part of a religious pilgrimage to the temples of Khnum, the ram-headed god who controlled the annual flooding of the Nile. Her entourage included priests, servants, and guards whose presence provided perfect cover for meetings that needed to remain invisible to casual observers. But among the pilgrims was a Mesopotamian merchant named Ashur-dan, whose extensive travels throughout the Hittite Empire made him an ideal intermediary for the sensitive communications that would follow. The conversation that took place in a small shrine dedicated to Isis, goddess of magic and protection, established protocols that would govern one of the most successful intelligence operations in ancient history. Kamwaset and Ashur-dan developed codes based on religious texts that both cultures shared, created methods for verifying the authenticity of messages, and established a network of contacts who could carry information across the hundreds of miles that separated the Egyptian and Hittite capitals. But more importantly, they began to explore the possibility of preventing the devastating war that many observers believed was inevitable between their two empires. Both Egypt and the Hittite kingdom were reaching the limits of their expansion, creating friction along borders that stretched across modern-day Syria and Lebanon. Military commanders on both sides were preparing for conflicts that could drain their treasuries and cost thousands of lives, while producing no clear victor. Kamwaset realized that her unique position offered an unprecedented opportunity to influence the course of history. Through her communications with Hittite representatives, she could help identify areas where compromise might be possible, where territorial disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than warfare, where the two great powers might find common ground in facing threats from other directions. The intelligence she gathered through these channels proved invaluable to Rameses, even though he never learned its true source. Reports about Hittite military capabilities, assessments of their economic resources, and insights into their political dynamics allowed the pharaoh to make informed decisions about Egyptian strategy without ever suspecting that his most trusted courtesan was maintaining direct contact with his greatest rival. This arrangement continued for nearly 2 years, during which Kamwaset became perhaps the best-informed person in the ancient world about the balance of power between the era's two dominant civilizations. She understood Egyptian capabilities pharaohs from her daily interactions with the court, and she gained deep insights into Hittite strengths and weaknesses through her secret diplomatic channels. But the most remarkable aspect of her activities was how she used this knowledge to gradually ear both saint empires away from the catastrophic confrontation that had seemed inevitable. Through carefully crafted suggestions to Rameses, she influenced Egyptian foreign policy in directions that reduced tensions with the Hittites, while strengthening Egypt's position relative to other potential threats. Simultaneously, her communications with Hittite representatives helped them understand Egyptian perspectives and concerns, making it easier for both sides to avoid the kinds of misunderstandings that had historically triggered wars between great powers. She became, in effect, a one-woman diplomatic corps, whose efforts prevented conflicts that could have devastated the entire region. The success of these efforts culminated in one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the ancient world, though Kamwaset's role in creating the conditions for this success would remain hidden for thousands of years. The stage was being set for negotiations that would produce the world's first recorded peace treaty between major powers, an agreement that would establish principles of international law that influence diplomatic relations to this day. But even as she celebrated these remarkable achievements, Kamwaset knew that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. The very success of her diplomatic efforts had attracted attention from other quarters, including some of the most dangerous and sophisticated intelligence networks in the ancient world. The Persian spy network had been watching Kamwaset's activities for months before they made their first move. Led by a shadowy figure known only as Artaxerxes the Silent, these operatives had infiltrated courts throughout the region, gathering intelligence that could be used to destabilize the delicate balance of power between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. What made the Persian network so dangerous wasn't just their skill at gathering information. They understood that the greatest empires could be brought down not through military conquest alone, but by destroying the trust and communication that held alliances together. If they could expose Kamwaset's secret diplomatic role, they could trigger exactly the kind of suspicion and paranoia that would make peace between Egypt and the Hittites impossible. Their first probe came during the festival of Thoth, when scribes and scholars throughout the ancient world gathered in Thebes to share knowledge and celebrate the god of wisdom. Among the visiting dignitaries was a Persian scholar named Darius, whose reputation for linguistic expertise had earned him invitations to royal courts across the region. But beneath his scholarly exterior, Darius was one of Artaxerxes' most skilled operatives. Darius approached Khaemweset during a reception at the Temple of Karnak, engaging her in what appeared to be casual conversation about ancient texts and religious practices. But his questions were carefully designed to probe her knowledge of Hittite customs and language, testing whether her understanding went beyond what any Egyptian, however educated, should reasonably possess. The interrogation was so subtle that most people would never have recognized it as anything more than academic discussion. But Khaemweset had spent years learning to detect the hidden meanings beneath surface conversations. She realized within minutes that this supposed scholar was fishing for information that could compromise her position, and she responded with a performance that would have impressed the finest actors in Thebes. She allowed herself to display exactly the level of knowledge that a well-educated courtesan might be expected to possess, demonstrating familiarity with Hittite culture that could be explained through interactions with merchants and diplomats, while carefully avoiding any insights that would suggest direct contact with Hittite officials. Her responses were so perfectly calibrated that Darius left the encounter convinced that earlier reports about her activities had been exaggerated, but Khaemweset knew that this initial probe would not be the last. The Persian network was too sophisticated to rely on a single test, and her successful deflection of their questions would only make them more determined to uncover the truth about her activities that she needed. She realized to take pro, but the entire diplomatic, active measures to protect not just her self-framework she had worked so hard to establish. The solution came to her during Aro-mentioned private audience with Ramesses, when the Pharaoh his growing concerns about Persian expansion into territories that had traditionally been within Egypt's sphere of influence. Persian gold was funding rebellions in Nubian provinces. Persian agents were stirring up trouble among Egyptian allies in the Levant, and Persian merchants were systematically gathering intelligence about Egyptian military capabilities. Khaemweset saw an opportunity to transform a threat into an advantage. Rather than simply defending against Persian espionage, she proposed creating a counterintelligence operation that would feed false information to Persian agents while identifying their networks throughout the region. The plan required resources and authority that only the pharaoh could provide, but it also offered benefits that extended far beyond protecting her own activities. Ramesses was intrigued by the proposal, particularly when Khaemweset explained how such an operation could simultaneously strengthen Egypt's diplomatic position with the Hittites. By sharing selected intelligence about Persian activities with Hittite representatives, Egypt could demonstrate its value as an ally while creating common cause against a mutual threat. The authorization came within days, along with access to resources that transformed Khaemweset from an individual operator into the leader of one of the most sophisticated intelligence organizations in the ancient world. She gained control of a budget that allowed her to recruit agents throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, establish safe houses in major trading centers, and create communication networks that could move information across vast distances with remarkable speed. But the most important resource she gained was legitimacy. Her activities now had official sanction from the highest levels of the Egyptian government, which meant that she could operate with confidence that her efforts would be supported even if they were exposed. The transformation also allowed her to bring other talented individuals into her operations, expanding her capabilities beyond what any single person could accomplish. The first recruit was Ankhesenamun, a young woman whose background was almost as unlikely as Khaemweset's own. The daughter of a Nubian chieftain who had been educated in Egyptian schools as part of a diplomatic exchange program, Ankhesenamun possessed linguistic skills that made her invaluable for operations in the southern provinces. She spoke fluent Nubian, Kushite, and several other African languages, and her appearance allowed her to blend seamlessly into communities where Egyptian agents would be immediately recognized as foreigners. More importantly, Ankhesenamun shared Khaemweset's understanding that intelligence work required more than just gathering information. She possessed the analytical skills necessary to evaluate conflicting reports, identify patterns that others might miss, and develop strategies that could turn raw intelligence into political advantage. Within weeks of joining the operation, she had identified 3 Persian agents operating in Elephantine and developed plans for turning them into double agents. The second major recruit was Senenmut, a former priest whose falling out with the religious hierarchy had left him bitter and looking for new purpose. His years in the temples had given him access to networks of priests and scribes throughout Egypt, contacts who could provide information about everything from local political sentiment to the movement of goods and people across provincial boundaries. Senenmut's religious training had also given him skills that proved unexpectedly valuable for intelligence work. His ability to memorize vast amounts of text allowed him to serve as a human library for sensitive information that couldn't be committed to written records. His understanding of religious symbolism provided perfect cover for coded communications that would appear to casual observers as nothing more than theological discussions. Together, this team began operations that fundamentally changed the balance of power in the ancient Near East. Their first major success came when they identified a Persian plot to assassinate the Hittite crown prince during a diplomatic mission to Damascus. The intelligence allowed Khaemweset to warn her Hittite contacts through established channels, preventing what would have been a catastrophic blow to regional stability. The warning also demonstrated to the Hittites that Egypt possessed intelligence capabilities that could be valuable to their security, opening new channels for cooperation that went beyond the territorial disputes that had previously dominated their relationship. For the first time, representatives of both empires began discussing common threats and shared interests, laying groundwork for the comprehensive peace agreement that would soon follow. But the Persian response to this setback revealed just how sophisticated and dangerous their operations had become. Rather than retreating or changing tactics, they escalated their efforts in ways that threatened not just Khaemweset's network, but the stability of the entire region. Intelligence reports began reaching Thebes about massive Persian military preparations, suggesting that diplomacy was about to give warfare on way to open a scale that would dwarf previous conflicts. The reports were disturbing enough that Ramesses convened emergency sessions of his war council, bringing together military commanders and diplomatic advisors to assess the threat and develop response strategies. The debates were intense, with some officials arguing for immediate military mobilization, while others counseled patience and further intelligence gathering. Khaemweset found herself in the unique position of possessing information that could clarify the situation. But obtaining that information required activating intelligence assets that she had been carefully preserving for exactly this kind of crisis. The decision to deploy these resources would expose agents who had taken years to position, but the alternative might be a war that could destroy everything she had worked to accomplish. The critical intelligence came from an unexpected source. Meritaten, an Egyptian noblewoman who had married a Persian provincial governor as part of a diplomatic arrangement, had been secretly reporting on Persian activities for over a year. Her position gave her access to high-level discussions about Persian strategy, but using her information effectively required confirming it through independent sources. The confirmation came through a network of Phoenician merchants who had been cultivating relationships with Persian officials throughout the empire. These traders were motivated not by political loyalties, but by commercial interests, and they provided a clear picture of Persian capabilities and intentions that contradicted the alarming reports reaching Thebes through other channels. The truth was both better and worse than Egyptian officials had feared. Persian military preparations were indeed extensive, but they were directed not toward immediate conquest of Egypt or the Hittite Empire. Instead, the Persians were preparing for a massive campaign against Greek city-states that had been interfering with Persian trade routes and territorial ambitions in Anatolia. This intelligence fundamentally changed Egyptian strategic calculations. Rather than facing an immediate threat that required costly military mobilization, Egypt had an opportunity to influence the outcome of a conflict that could reshape the balance of power throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The key question was whether to support the Greeks, who had traditionally been Egyptian trading partners, or to maintain neutrality, while the Persians dealt with what they saw as a regional problem. Khemwaset realized that this situation offered unprecedented opportunities for advancing Egyptian interests, but only if the response was carefully calibrated to avoid triggering the larger war that everyone wanted to prevent. Her recommendation to Rameses was audacious in its scope and sophisticated in its understanding of regional dynamics. She proposed that Egypt should offer to mediate between the Persians and the Greeks, positioning itself as a neutral party whose interests lay in maintaining regional stability rather than supporting any particular faction. This approach would allow Egypt to gather intelligence about both Persian and Greek capabilities while demonstrating to the Hittites that Egyptian diplomacy could provide alternatives to military confrontation. The mediation offer required delicate handling, since both the Persians and the Greeks had reasons to be suspicious of Egyptian motives. But Khemwaset's network provided channels for approaching both sides through intermediaries who could present the Egyptian proposal in terms that addressed their specific concerns and interests. The Persian response came first, delivered through Meritaten during one of her carefully orchestrated visits to Thebes. Persian officials were intrigued by the possibility of resolving their Greek problem through negotiation rather than warfare. Egyptian mediation could provide them, particularly if with territorial concessions that military action might not achieve. The Greek response was more complex, reflecting the fractured nature of their political system. Some city-states were interested in Egyptian mediation, while others preferred to rely on their own military capabilities or seek support from other regional powers. The diversity of Greek positions created opportunities for Egyptian diplomacy, but it also required more sophisticated approaches than dealing with centralized Persian administration. Over the following months, Khemwaset found herself managing one of the most complex diplomatic operations in ancient history. She was simultaneously coordinating with Persian officials through established intelligence channels, negotiating with multiple Greek factions through Phoenician intermediaries, and maintaining her secret communications with Hittite representatives who were watching these developments with intense interest. The juggling act required skills that went far beyond anything she had previously attempted. She needed to understand not just the stated positions of various parties, but their underlying motivations, their internal political pressures, and their assessments of regional power dynamics. She had to anticipate how developments in one set of negotiations might affect relationships with other parties, and she had to maintain the delicate balance that kept all sides engaged in the diplomatic process. The breakthrough came during a series of meetings held on the island of Cyprus, a location chosen because it was accessible to representatives from all the major powers, while remaining neutral territory where no single faction held overwhelming influence. The meetings were officially described as trade negotiations, providing perfect cover for the sensitive political discussions with their real purpose. Khemwaset attended these meetings as part of the Egyptian trade delegation, but her real role was coordinating the complex diplomatic dance that would determine whether the region moved toward war or peace. The negotiations required her to draw upon every skill she had developed over years of court intrigue and international diplomacy. The final agreement exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The Persians agreed to abandon their planned military campaign against the Greeks in exchange for commercial concessions and territorial adjustments that could be achieved through peaceful means. The Greeks accepted the arrangements because they provided economic benefits while avoiding a war they weren't certain they could win. Most importantly for Egyptian interests, the agreement established Egypt as the guarantor of the new arrangements, giving Ramesses influence over regional affairs that extended far beyond Egypt's traditional sphere of control. The success also demonstrated to the Hittites that Egyptian diplomacy could achieve results that military action could not, creating momentum for the comprehensive peace treaty that both empires desperately needed. But even as she celebrated these remarkable achievements, Khayemweset knew that her most dangerous challenges were still ahead. The very success of her operations had made her a target for forces that preferred chaos to stability, and her growing influence had attracted enemies who possessed resources and capabilities that matched her own. The greatest threat came from an unexpected direction. Nefertiti the Younger, a distant relative of the famous queen whose beauty and political skills had made her a legend, had been watching Khayemweset's rise with a mixture of admiration and jealousy that was slowly transforming into something far more dangerous. Nefertiti the Younger had grown up hearing stories of her legendary namesake, tales of a queen who had wielded power alongside Akhenaten during one of Egypt's most turbulent periods. But where the original Nefertiti had achieved influence through marriage to a pharaoh, this descendant had chosen a different path entirely. She had cultivated her own network of allies and resources, building a power base that operated entirely outside the traditional structures of Egyptian society. What made Nefertiti the Younger so dangerous wasn't just her political ambitions or her considerable resources. She possessed something that most of Khayemweset's previous enemies had lacked: a genuine understanding of how intelligence networks functioned and the patience to wage warfare that could continue for years without obvious results. She had spent the better part of a decade studying Khayemweset's methods, learning to recognize the subtle signs of her operations, and identifying weaknesses that could be exploited at precisely the right moment. The first indication of trouble came through Ankhesenamun, whose contacts in the southern provinces began reporting unusual activities that didn't fit established patterns. Nubian merchants who had previously been reliable sources of information were suddenly reluctant to discuss political developments. Border guards who had been cooperative were asking unexpected questions about Egyptian intelligence operations. Most disturbing of all, several of her most trusted agents had simply disappeared without explanation. The pattern suggested systematic compromise of Egyptian intelligence networks, but the methods were so sophisticated that identifying the source proved nearly impossible. Whoever was behind these operations possessed detailed knowledge of Egyptian procedures and had access to resources that allowed them to operate across multiple provinces simultaneously. Khayemweset realized that she was facing an adversary whose capabilities matched her own, someone who understood that the most effective way to destroy an intelligence network was not through direct confrontation, but by gradually eroding the trust and communication that held it together. The attacks were designed to create paranoia and uncertainty that would eventually cause the network to collapse from within. Her response demonstrated why she had become one of the most formidable operators in the ancient world. Rather than attempting to identify and confront her unknown enemy directly, she chose to use their attacks as an opportunity to strengthen her own position while gathering intelligence about their methods and resources. The strategy required sacrificing assets that had taken years to develop, but it also created opportunities to feed false information to hostile networks while identifying their operational patterns. She began by establishing a series of apparently vulnerable intelligence channels that were actually elaborate traps designed to capture enemy agents and reveal their communications methods. The first success came when Senenmut identified a pattern in the questions being asked by compromised sources. The inquiries were too sophisticated to come from casual curiosity, and they revealed knowledge of Egyptian operations that could only have been obtained through systematic intelligence gathering. More importantly, the questions suggested that the hostile network was particularly interested in Khayemweset's diplomatic communications with Hittite representatives. This discovery fundamentally changed her assessment of the threat she was facing. The attacks weren't simply attempts to damage Egyptian intelligence capabilities. They were specifically designed to undermine the diplomatic framework that had been preventing war between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Someone was deliberately trying to destroy the peace process. and they possessed the resources and knowledge necessary to achieve that goal. The realization led Khayemset to a conclusion that was both obvious and terrifying. The only person who could have detailed knowledge of her diplomatic activities while possessing the resources to mount such sophisticated attacks was someone within the Egyptian court itself. She was facing not just a foreign enemy, but a domestic rival whose access to information and resources matched her own. The hunt for this domestic enemy required skills that went beyond conventional intelligence work. Khayemset had to investigate people who were nominally her allies, questioning the loyalty of individuals who had worked alongside her for years. She had to do this while maintaining the operational security that protected ongoing diplomatic and intelligence activities. And she had to avoid creating the kind of paranoia that could destroy the very networks she was trying to protect. The investigation began with a careful analysis of who had access to information about her various operations. The list was surprisingly short, limited to individuals who had demonstrated both competence and trustworthiness over extended periods. But someone on that list was systematically betraying Egyptian interests, and identifying them required methods that pushed the boundaries of what even Khayemset considered acceptable. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Meritaten, during one of her visits from Persian territory, mentioned a conversation she had overheard between Persian officials discussing intelligence they had received about Egyptian diplomatic activities. The information was accurate enough to be genuinely damaging, but it contained small errors that suggested it had been filtered through intermediaries rather than obtained directly from Egyptian sources. More importantly, the errors were consistent with misconceptions that only one person in Khayemset's inner circle was known to hold. Nefertiti the Younger had always slightly misunderstood certain aspects of Hittite diplomatic protocols, mistakes that Khayemset had never bothered to correct because they seemed insignificant. But those same mistakes were reflected in the intelligence that Persian officials were discussing, providing a clear trail that led directly to her rival. The confirmation of Nefertiti the Younger's treachery came through a trap that was elegant in its simplicity. Khayemset arranged for false information about Egyptian military preparations to be shared with her inner circle, with slightly different versions given to each individual. When Persian agents began asking questions that reflected the specific version shared with Nefertiti the Younger, the identity of the traitor was definitively established. But knowing who was betraying Egyptian interests and proving it in ways that would satisfy Ramesses were entirely different challenges. Nefertiti the Younger was too sophisticated to leave obvious evidence of her treachery, and her family connections provided protection that made direct accusations extremely dangerous. Khayemset needed to find a way to neutralize the threat without triggering a scandal that could undermine confidence in Egyptian intelligence operations. The solution required patience and strategic thinking that demonstrated why Khayemset had become legendary throughout the ancient world. Rather than confronting Nefertiti the Younger directly, she decided to use her rival's own methods against her, feeding false information that would expose her treachery, while simultaneously advancing Egyptian interests. The plan began with carefully crafted intelligence about supposed Egyptian weaknesses that would be irresistible to Persian officials. Khayemset arranged for Nefertiti the Younger to learn about fictional problems with Egyptian military supplies, imaginary disagreements between Ramesses and his generals, and non-existent vulnerabilities in Egyptian defensive positions. The information was designed to encourage Persian aggression that would ultimately work to Egypt's advantage. When Persian officials began making decisions based on this false intelligence, their actions revealed not only the extent of Nefertiti the Younger's betrayal, but also the sophisticated network she had built to transmit information to Egypt's enemies. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But more importantly, it demonstrated that her treachery had actually been turned to Egypt's benefit through superior intelligence work. The confrontation took place in the same Garden of Isis, where Khayemset had first met her mentor years earlier. But this time, she was the one in the position of authority, facing someone whose ambitions had led to betrayal of everything they both claimed to serve. Nefertiti the Younger arrived expecting to discuss coordination of their respective intelligence networks, unaware that her treachery had been discovered and turned against her. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Khemweset didn't begin with accusations or threats. Instead, she calmly described the false intelligence that Nefertiti the Younger had been passing to Persian agents, explaining in precise detail how that information had been crafted to mislead Egypt's enemies while advancing Egyptian strategic objectives. The realization of how completely she had been outmaneuvered broke Nefertiti the Younger's composure in ways that direct confrontation never could have achieved. She had spent months believing that she was successfully undermining Khemweset's operations, only to discover that she had actually been an unwitting agent of Egyptian interests. Her network of contacts, her carefully cultivated relationships with foreign agents, her sophisticated methods of transmitting information had all been turned against her without her knowledge. But Khemweset's triumph came with an offer that demonstrated the political sophistication that had made her indispensable to Ramesses. Rather than demanding punishment or public exposure, she proposed that Nefertiti the Younger continue her relationship with Persian agents, but now as a conscious double agent working under Egyptian direction. The arrangement would allow Egypt to maintain influence over Persian decision-making, while giving Nefertiti the Younger an opportunity to redeem herself through genuine service to her homeland. The proposal was brilliant in its recognition of political realities. Exposing Nefertiti Younger's treachery would create a scandal that could undermine confidence in Egyptian intelligence operations, while destroying valuable assets that had taken years to develop. Converting her into a conscious double agent would preserve those assets while ensuring that future intelligence operations served Egyptian rather than Persian interests. The agreement that followed established protocols that would govern one of the most successful double-agent operations in ancient history. Nefertiti the Younger would continue her contacts with Persian officials, but now she would be feeding them information that was carefully crafted to advance Egyptian strategic objectives. She would also provide intelligence about Persian capabilities and intentions that could help Egypt respond more effectively to future threats. The arrangement required trust between two women who had every reason to remain enemies, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect for each other's capabilities and a shared recognition that their homeland's interests transcended personal rivalries. Both understood that the success of their collaboration would determine whether Egypt could maintain its position as a dominant power in a rapidly changing world, the first one that either had expected. Intelligence test of their partnership came, so reports began reaching Thebes about a new threat that made previous Persian activities seem insignificant by comparison. The Sea Peoples, mysterious maritime raiders whose origins remained unknown, were beginning to appear in the eastern Mediterranean in numbers that suggested coordinated rather than random attacks. These raiders possessed military capabilities that surprised established powers throughout the region. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable than traditional war vessels. Their warriors fought with weapons and tactics that conventional armies struggled to counter, and their attacks were coordinated in ways that suggested sophisticated leadership and strategic planning. Most disturbing of all, the Sea Peoples seemed to possess detailed intelligence about the defenses and capabilities of the civilizations they attacked. Their raids targeted specific vulnerabilities while avoiding areas where resistance would be strongest, suggesting that they had access to information that should have been closely guarded military secrets. The threat posed by the Sea Peoples was fundamentally different from anything that established powers had previously faced. These weren't rival empires seeking territorial expansion or commercial advantage. They appeared to be nomadic warriors whose objectives remained unclear but whose capabilities were undeniably formidable. Traditional diplomatic solutions seemed irrelevant when dealing with enemies whose motivations and organizational structures remained mysterious. Khemweset realized that confronting this new threat would require intelligence capabilities that went beyond anything she had previously attempted. She needed to gather information about enemies whose origins, objectives, and methods were completely unknown. She had to do this while maintaining her existing operations and managing the complex diplomatic relationships that kept the region from descending into general warfare. The challenge required resources that exceeded what any single intelligence network could provide. For the first time in her career, Khaemwaset found herself in the position of needing to coordinate with foreign intelligence services, sharing information and resources with former enemies in order to confront a threat that endangered everyone equally. The collaboration began with her Hittite contacts, who had been tracking Sea People activities in the northern Mediterranean. Hittite intelligence had identified patterns in the raids that suggested the attackers were operating from bases in regions that no established power controlled. They had also observed that Sea People tactics varied depending on the type of target they were attacking, indicating sophisticated military organization rather than random piracy. The Persian intelligence network, now partially controlled through Nefertiti the Younger, provided information about Sea People activities in the eastern Mediterranean. Persian agents had observed that the raiders seemed particularly interested in disrupting trade routes, suggesting economic rather than purely military objectives. They had also noted that Sea People attacks were often followed by the appearance of merchants offering to purchase goods at prices well below normal market rates. The pattern that emerged from combining these various intelligence sources was both illuminating and disturbing. The Sea Peoples weren't simply raiders seeking immediate plunder. They appeared to be part of a systematic campaign to disrupt the established trade networks and political relationships that held the ancient world together. Their attacks were designed to weaken existing powers while creating opportunities for new forms of organization and control. The realization fundamentally changed how established powers needed to respond to the threat. Military action alone wouldn't be sufficient, because the Sea Peoples weren't seeking to conquer territory that could be defended through conventional means. They were attacking the economic and political foundations of civilization itself, requiring responses that address those underlying vulnerabilities, rather than simply their military manifestations. Khaemwaset proposed a coordinated response that would demonstrate the full extent of her strategic thinking. Rather than each power attempting to defend its own territory independently, she suggested creating a shared intelligence network that could track Sea People movements across the entire Mediterranean. The information gathered through this network would allow coordinated defensive measures that could anticipate and counter Sea People tactics more effectively than isolated responses. The proposal required unprecedented cooperation between powers that had traditionally been rivals or enemies. Egyptian, Hittite, and Persian intelligence services would need to share information and coordinate operations in ways that had never been attempted. The arrangement would also require establishing new protocols for protecting sensitive information, while ensuring that intelligence reached decision-makers quickly enough to be actionable. The negotiations required to establish this cooperation tested every diplomatic skill that Khaemwaset had developed over years of intelligence work. She had to convince officials from multiple empires that sharing intelligence with traditional rivals was preferable to facing the Sea People threat independently. She had to address concerns about protecting sensitive information while ensuring that the shared intelligence would be comprehensive enough to be effective. The breakthrough came when a coordinated Sea People attack struck multiple targets simultaneously, demonstrating that the threat was beyond what any single power could handle independently. Egyptian ports in the Nile Delta were attacked on the same day that Hittite coastal cities came under assault, while Persian maritime trade routes were disrupted by raiders operating with obvious coordination and sophisticated planning. The synchronized nature of these attacks provided the final evidence needed to convince skeptical officials that cooperation was essential for survival. Within weeks, representatives from all major powers were meeting on Cyprus to establish the protocols that would govern the most extensive intelligence sharing operation in ancient history. The agreements reached during these meetings created a framework that would influence international cooperation for centuries. Participating powers agreed to share intelligence about sea people activities while maintaining separate networks for information that related to their bilateral relationships. They established procedures for coordinating defensive measures without revealing sensitive information about military capabilities or strategic planning. Most importantly, they created mechanisms for rapid communication that could warn all participants about emerging threats, regardless of which intelligence network first detected them. The system allowed information to move across the ancient world in days rather than weeks, providing decision-makers with the timely intelligence they needed to respond effectively to rapidly developing situations. The first major success of this coordinated approach came when Egyptian agents detected preparations for a massive Sea People assault on the Nile Delta. The intelligence was shared with Hittite and Persian networks, who were able to confirm the threat and provide additional information about the timing and scale of the planned attack. The coordinated response that followed demonstrated the potential of international intelligence cooperation. Egyptian forces were able to prepare defensive positions based on accurate intelligence about Sea People tactics and objectives. Hittite naval units were repositioned to intercept Sea People reinforcements, while Persian agents provided information that allowed Egyptian commanders to anticipate and counter specific aspects of the enemy battle plan. The resulting battle was one of the most decisive victories achieved against the Sea Peoples during their entire campaign of raids and attacks. More importantly, the success demonstrated that coordinated intelligence and defensive measures could neutralize threats that had previously seemed overwhelming. But the victory also revealed new aspects of the Sea People threat that were more disturbing than anything previously discovered. Captured raiders possessed equipment and weapons that indicated access to resources and manufacturing capabilities that exceeded what nomadic peoples should have been able to develop independently. Their knowledge of Egyptian defensive preparations suggested intelligence networks that rivaled those of established powers. Most significantly, interrogation of prisoners revealed that the Sea Peoples were not simply raiders seeking plunder or territory. They were part of a systematic campaign to destabilize the existing order throughout the Mediterranean world, creating conditions that would allow new forms of political and economic organization to emerge from the chaos they created. The implications of these discoveries forced Khemwaset to confront the possibility that her entire career had been preparation for challenges that went beyond anything she had previously imagined. The skills she had developed in palace intrigue, diplomatic negotiation, and intelligence operations were about to be tested against enemies whose objectives threatened the very foundations of the civilization she had spent her life defending. The stage was being set for conflicts that would determine whether the ancient world's great civilizations could adapt to new forms of warfare and political organization, or whether they would collapse under pressures they had never been designed to withstand. Khemwaset found herself at the center of these developments, her networks and relationships providing the only reliable sources of information about threats that could reshape the known world. The woman who had begun her career as a humble courtesan in the workers' quarter of Thebes had become one of the most important figures in the ancient world, her decisions influencing the fate of empires and the survival of civilizations that had endured for millennia. But her greatest challenges still lay ahead, as the Sea Peoples prepared to unleash forces that would test everything she had learned about power, politics, and the delicate relationships that held the ancient world together. The evidence of advanced Sea People organization reached Khemwaset through channels that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. A Phoenician merchant named Hiram, whose trading vessels had been tracking the mysterious raiders across multiple sea routes, brought intelligence that shattered every assumption about their primitive nature. These weren't desperate nomads fleeing some distant catastrophe. They were operating with resources and coordination that suggested backing from established powers. Hiram's report, delivered during a clandestine meeting in the ruins of an abandoned temple near Memphis, painted a picture that chilled even Khemwaset's experienced blood. The Sea Peoples possessed detailed maps of Egyptian harbours that could only have been created through systematic reconnaissance over many months. Their weapons weren't crude tribal implements, but sophisticated bronze work that matched the quality produced in the finest workshops of established civilizations. Most disturbing of all, captured Sea People equipment bore markings that Hiram recognized from his extensive travels. The bronze had been smelted using techniques specific to workshops in Anatolia. The leatherwork showed characteristics of Nubian craftsmanship. The pottery fragments found at their abandoned campsites had been made with clay that originated in regions controlled by various Mediterranean powers. The implications were staggering. The Sea Peoples weren't operating independently. They were being supplied and supported by a network that extended throughout the known world, a conspiracy that involved collaborators within the very civilizations they were attacking. Someone was deliberately orchestrating the destabilization of the ancient world, the Seed's political order, using people as instruments of a strategy that remained hidden behind layers of deception and misdirection. Khaimwaset realized that she was facing an enemy whose sophistication matched or exceeded her own. The attacks that had seemed like random raids were actually components of a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to weaken established powers while concealing the identity and objectives of whoever was directing them. The true enemy remained invisible, manipulating events from behind a screen of maritime chaos and political confusion. The investigation required mobilizing every asset she had developed over years of intelligence work. Ankhesenamon's network in the southern provinces began tracking the movement of materials and personnel that could be supporting Sea People operations. Senenmut's religious contacts provided information about unusual activities around temples and sacred sites that might be serving as meeting points for conspirators. Even Nefertiti the Younger's relationship with Persian agents became a crucial source of intelligence about activities in the Eastern Mediterranean. Through carefully crafted questions, she was able to determine that Persian officials were as puzzled by Sea People capabilities as their Egyptian counterparts, suggesting that the conspiracy extended beyond any single established power. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Mary Tartan, during one of her visits from Persian territory, mentioned a conversation she had overheard about strange purchases being made by merchants who claimed to represent clients in distant lands. Large quantities of bronze, leather, and other materials were being acquired by individuals who paid premium prices for immediate delivery but provided no clear explanation for their urgent needs. The pattern of purchases was revealing. The quantities suggested military applications, but the specific combinations of materials didn't match the normal requirements of any established army. Bronze was being acquired alongside materials needed for shipbuilding, while food supplies were being purchased in quantities that suggested feeding large numbers of people in remote locations where normal supply chains wouldn't reach. Khaimwaset began mapping these unusual commercial activities, looking for patterns that might reveal the locations where Sea People operations were being organized and supplied. The work required combining intelligence from multiple sources while maintaining the operational security that protected her various networks from discovery. The map that gradually emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. The unusual purchases were being made through a network of intermediaries that extended from the Black Sea to the Western Mediterranean, with concentration points that suggested major organizational centers on coastal regions, that islands, and were supposedly uninhabited or controlled by minor local rulers. One location stood out with particular significance. The island of Crete, which had been largely abandoned since the collapse of the Minoan civilization generations earlier, showed patterns of activity that couldn't be explained by the small population of farmers and fishermen who supposedly constituted its only inhabitants. Large quantities of materials were flowing to the island, but nothing of comparable value was being exported. The intelligence suggested that Crete was serving as a major base for Sea People operations, a location where ships could be built and supplied, warriors could be trained and equipped, and attacks could be planned and coordinated without interference from established powers. The island's strategic position in the central Mediterranean made it an ideal location for controlling sea routes throughout the region. But investigating Crete required resources and risks that exceeded anything Camwaset had previously attempted. The island was hundreds of miles from Egypt, accessible only by sea routes that were now controlled by the very enemies she was trying to investigate. Any intelligence operation would require cooperation from naval forces and diplomatic cover that could only be provided at the highest levels of government. The proposal she presented to Rameses was audacious in its scope and implications. She requested authorization for a joint expedition involving Egyptian naval forces, intelligence operatives from multiple allied powers, and diplomatic cover that would allow them to investigate Crete under the pretext of establishing new trading relationships. The mission would require unprecedented cooperation between powers that had traditionally been rivals, coordination of military and intelligence assets on a scale never before attempted, an acceptance of risks that could trigger exactly the kind of general warfare that everyone was trying to avoid. But the alternative was allowing an unknown enemy to continue destabilizing the region while remaining safely hidden behind their maritime screen. Rameses' authorization came with resources that transformed the proposed investigation into one of the most ambitious intelligence operations in ancient history. Egyptian warships would provide naval support, while diplomatic missions to allied powers would secure the cooperation needed to make the expedition appear legitimate to casual observers. The planning required months of careful coordination between intelligence services that had only recently begun sharing information. Egyptian naval commanders needed to understand the intelligence requirements while avoiding actions that would alert potential enemies to the mission's true purpose. Diplomatic representatives had to negotiate agreements that would provide the necessary cover while protecting sensitive information about the operation's real objectives. The expedition that finally departed from Alexandria was a masterpiece of deception and coordination. To external observers, it appeared to be a routine diplomatic and commercial mission designed to establish new trade relationships throughout the Mediterranean. The ships carried merchants, diplomats, and scholars whose presence provided perfect cover for the intelligence operatives who constituted the mission's real purpose. Camwaset travelled as part of the diplomatic delegation, her official role being to negotiate commercial agreements that would benefit Egyptian traders. But her real mission was to coordinate the intelligence gathering that would either confirm or refute the theories about Crete's role in supporting sea people operations. The voyage across the Mediterranean provided opportunities to gather intelligence about sea people activities from multiple sources. Encounters with other merchant vessels allowed Camwaset's team to collect information about unusual shipping patterns, changes in local political conditions, and rumors about mysterious activities on various islands and coastal regions. The intelligence gathered during the voyage confirmed that something extraordinary was happening throughout the Mediterranean world. Traditional trade routes were being disrupted not just by sea people raids, but by the emergence of new commercial networks that operated outside established patterns. Merchants who had traded the same routes for generations were reporting encounters with ships and crews they had never seen before, vessels that appeared to be operating under no recognizable authority. More disturbing were reports of coastal communities that had simply disappeared, their inhabitants vanishing without explanation or obvious signs of violence. These weren't the dramatic raids that had characterized most sea people attacks. They were quiet disappearances that suggested systematic recruitment or relocation of population on a massive scale. The pattern suggested that the sea peoples weren't just raiding established communities for plunder. They were systematically extracting people, resources, and knowledge from throughout the Mediterranean world, building their own civilization using components stolen or coerced from existing powers. The scale of this operation exceeded anything that could be accomplished by simple raiders or nomadic tribes. When the expedition finally reached Crete, the evidence of massive organized activity was undeniable. The supposedly abandoned harbors showed signs of recent construction and heavy use. Roads that official records indicated had been unused for decades, were clearly maintained and heavily traveled. Most tellingly, the expedition's arrival was observed by lookouts, whose presence indicated sophisticated intelligence gathering and communication systems. The diplomatic cover allowed Khaemwaset's team to establish a temporary base in one of Crete's supposedly inactive ports, providing opportunities for systematic intelligence gathering about the island's real activities. What they discovered exceeded even their most pessimistic expectations about the scale and sophistication of Sea People operations. Crete wasn't just a base for Sea People raids. It had become the administrative center for a shadow civilization that was systematically extracting resources, knowledge, and population from established powers throughout the Mediterranean world. The island hosted workshops where captured craftsmen produced weapons and ships, using techniques stolen from multiple civilizations. Training camps prepared warriors using military knowledge, acquired through systematic espionage against established armies. Most significantly, Crete had become home to a growing population of refugees, exiles, and voluntary emigrants from throughout the known world. These weren't captives or slaves, but people who had chosen to abandon their homelands in favor of a new form of civilization that promised freedom from the rigid hierarchies and traditional limitations that characterized established powers. The discovery fundamentally changed how Khaemwaset understood the threat posed by the Sea Peoples. They weren't simply raiders or barbarian invaders. They represented an alternative form of civilization that was attracting people who felt constrained or oppressed by traditional social structures. The conflict wasn't just military or political, but ideological, pitting established order against revolutionary change. The intelligence gathering on Crete required extraordinary caution, as the expedition's diplomatic cover provided only limited protection against discovery. Khaemwaset's operatives had to collect information about Sea People capabilities and organization, while avoiding activities that would reveal their true mission to hostile observers who were certainly monitoring their movements. The breakthrough came through an unexpected contact. Theseus, a former Athenian merchant whose trading empire had been destroyed by Sea People raids, had survived by offering his commercial expertise to his former enemies. His position within the Sea People organization provided access to information that no external intelligence operation could have obtained independently. Theseus approached Khaemwaset during a diplomatic reception, ostensibly to discuss potential commercial relationships between Egyptian and Cretan traders. But his real message, conveyed through careful references that only someone with extensive intelligence experience would recognize, was an offer to provide information about Sea People organization and objectives in exchange for guarantees about his future security. The negotiation that followed tested every diplomatic skill that Khaemwaset had developed over years of intelligence work. Theseus possessed information that could be crucial for understanding and countering Sea People operations, but his position within their organization made him potentially unreliable. He could be a genuine defector seeking to escape a situation that had become untenable, or he could be a sophisticated double agent attempting to feed false information to Egyptian intelligence. The verification process required comparing Theseus's information with intelligence, gathered through independent sources, while avoiding actions that would compromise either his position or the expedition's diplomatic cover. The work was painstaking and dangerous, requiring judgments about reliability and accuracy that could determine the success or failure of defensive measures against future Sea People attacks. The intelligence that Theseus provided was both invaluable and disturbing. The Sea Peoples were indeed operating under centralized leadership, but their organization was more sophisticated and ambitious than anyone had imagined. They weren't planning to simply raid and retreat, but to establish permanent settlements that would serve as bases for expanding their alternative civilization throughout the Mediterranean world. Their leadership included individuals with extensive experience in established powers, former officials and military commanders who had become disillusioned with traditional forms of government and had chosen to create something entirely new. These weren't barbarian chieftains, but sophisticated political thinkers who understood the weaknesses of existing civilizations and were systematically exploiting them. Most disturbing of all, the Sea Peoples had developed their own diplomatic and intelligence networks that rivaled those of established powers. They were conducting systematic espionage against Egyptian, Hittite, and Persian operations, while maintaining communication with sympathizers and potential collaborators within those civilizations. The realization that established powers were facing not just military threats, but ideological competition forced Khemwaset to reconsider everything she thought she understood about the nature of political conflict. The Sea Peoples weren't seeking to conquer existing territories or replace existing rulers. They were offering people throughout the Mediterranean world an alternative to the hierarchical systems that had dominated human organization for millennia. The appeal of this alternative was demonstrated by the steady stream of refugees and volunteers who were abandoning established civilizations to join Sea People communities. These weren't desperate people fleeing poverty or persecution, but individuals who had chosen to reject traditional forms of social organization in favor of something that promised greater personal freedom and social mobility. The intelligence gathered on Crete revealed that Sea People communities operated according to principles that were fundamentally different from was based on demonstrate established civilizations, leadership competence rather than inherited position. Economic relationships emphasized cooperation and mutual benefit rather than exploitation and hierarchy. Social structures provided opportunities for advancement that were available to anyone regardless of their original status or background. These organizational principles explained why Sea People military operations were so effective against conventional forces. Their warriors fought with the dedication of people defending their chosen way of life rather than simply following orders from distant authorities. Their commanders made decisions based on tactical considerations rather than political calculations that might compromise military effectiveness. The challenge facing established powers was how to respond to an enemy whose appeal went beyond military capability to fundamental questions about social organization and individual opportunity. Traditional military responses might defeat Sea People attacks, but they couldn't address the underlying attractions that were drawing people away from established civilizations. Khemwaset realized that the conflict would require strategies that went beyond conventional diplomacy and intelligence work. Established powers would need to address the social and economic conditions that made Sea People alternatives attractive to their own citizens. They would need to demonstrate that traditional forms of civilization could provide the opportunities and freedoms that people were seeking elsewhere. The expedition's return to Egypt marked the beginning of a new phase in Khemwaset's career, as she found herself responsible for developing responses to threats that challenged the basic assumptions of the civilization she had spent her life serving. The intelligence she had gathered provided crucial information about Sea People capabilities and organization, but it also raised fundamental questions about the future viability of traditional forms of political and social organization. Her report to Ramesses was comprehensive and disturbing, detailing Sea People capabilities while explaining the ideological challenges they represented. The Pharaoh's response demonstrated both his political sophistication and his recognition of the unprecedented nature of the threats facing Egypt. Rather than simply ordering military preparations to counter Sea People attacks, Ramesses authorized a comprehensive review of Egyptian policies and institutions that might be contributing to the attraction of Sea People alternatives. The investigation would examine everything from taxation and military service to legal procedures and social mobility, looking for areas where reforms might reduce the appeal of revolutionary alternatives. The policy review required Khemwaset to coordinate with officials throughout the Egyptian government, sharing intelligence about Sea People organization while facilitating discussions about potential domestic reforms. The work required diplomatic skills that went beyond traditional intelligence operations, as she had to navigate political sensitivities while maintaining the operational security that protected ongoing intelligence activities. The recommendations that emerged from this review were revolutionary in their own right, proposing changes to Egyptian society that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The proposals included reforms to taxation that would reduce burdens on common citizens, modifications to military service that would provide greater opportunities for advancement, and legal changes that would make Egyptian courts more accessible to people of modest means. Most significantly, the recommendations proposed creating new institutions that would allow talented individuals from any social background to contribute to government and military leadership. These changes would address the fundamental attractions of Sea People society while preserving the stability and continuity that had made Egyptian civilization successful for millennia. The implementation of these reforms required political courage that demonstrated Ramesses' understanding of the challenges facing traditional civilizations. The changes faced resistance from established elites who saw their privileges being threatened, but they also generated enthusiasm among common citizens who recognized opportunities that had previously been unavailable to them. The success of Egyptian reforms provided a model that other established powers could adapt to their own circumstances. The intelligence sharing networks that Khaemweset had developed provided channels for communicating information about successful policies, while coordinating responses to continuing Sea People activities. The transformation of Mediterranean politics that followed demonstrated the far-reaching consequences of intelligence work that went beyond simple information gathering to fundamental analysis of social and political trends. The woman who had begun her career as a courtesan in Thebes had become an architect of changes that would influence the development of civilization for centuries to come. But even as she celebrated these remarkable achievements, Khaemweset knew that new challenges were emerging that would test everything she had learned about power, politics, and the complex relationships that held human societies together. The Sea Peoples had been contained, but not eliminated, and their ideological appeal continued to attract followers who sought alternatives to traditional forms of social organization. The next phase of her career would require skills that went beyond intelligence gathering and diplomatic negotiation to fundamental questions about the nature of human society and the possibilities for creating forms of organization that could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving the achievements of past generations. The stage was being set for developments that would determine whether the ancient world's great civilizations could evolve to meet new challenges, or whether they would be replaced by alternatives that promised greater freedom at the cost of abandoning traditions that had taken millennia to develop. Khaemweset found herself at the center of these profound transformations, her networks and relationships providing the foundation for changes that would reshape the known world. The intelligence networks that Khaemweset had built across the Mediterranean were about to face their ultimate test, but the threat would come from a direction that none of her carefully cultivated sources had anticipated. While she had been focused on the Sea Peoples and their revolutionary ideology, another force had been quietly maneuvering in the shadows of Egyptian politics, one that understood her methods well enough to use them against her. The first sign of trouble came through a message that arrived during the height of the Nile's flooding season, when the great river transformed the landscape into a series of islands connected by channels that gleamed like silver under the desert sun. The messenger was a young priest from the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, his face bearing the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was carrying information he didn't fully understand. The message itself was encoded in religious language that would appear innocent to casual observers, but its meaning was unmistakable to anyone familiar with intelligence protocols. One of Khaemweset's most trusted agents in the northern provinces had been arrested by local authorities on charges of sedition and conspiracy against the state. The arrest had been carried out with a precision that suggested detailed knowledge of the agent's activities and contacts. But what made the situation truly alarming was the timing. The arrest had occurred just days after the agent had reported unusual military preparations in the region, activities that suggested someone was planning operations that could threaten Egyptian security. The coincidence was too perfect to be accidental, indicating that hostile forces had penetrated Egyptian intelligence networks deeply enough to neutralize threats to their own activities. Khaemweset realized immediately that she was facing a domestic conspiracy that possessed resources and knowledge that rivaled her own capabilities. Someone within the Egyptian government had access to information about her networks and was using that knowledge to protect activities that threatened the kingdom's security. The enemy wasn't operating from distant islands or foreign courts. but from within the very institutions she served. The investigation required extraordinary delicacy, as any obvious attempt to identify the source of the security breach could alert the conspirators and cause them to alter their methods or eliminate evidence. Khaemwaset had to gather intelligence about people who were nominally her colleagues while maintaining the appearance of normal operations that wouldn't suggest she suspected internal betrayal. The breakthrough came through Ankhesenamun, whose contacts in the southern provinces had noticed unusual patterns in official communications. Orders and directives that normally took days or weeks to reach distant outposts were arriving with suspicious speed, as if someone was using private channels to supplement official government communications. The pattern suggested the existence of a parallel administration that could move information and resources independently of established procedures. More disturbing were reports of meetings between regional officials and individuals who weren't part of the normal government hierarchy. These encounters were taking place in locations that provided privacy from official oversight, and they involved people whose presence in government facilities couldn't be explained through normal administrative functions. The evidence pointed toward a conspiracy that extended throughout the Egyptian administrative system, involving officials at multiple levels who were coordinating activities that remained hidden from central oversight. The scale of the operation suggested planning and resources that could only have been accumulated over many years of careful preparation. The realization forced Khaemwaset to confront the possibility that her entire career had been observed and analyzed by enemies who understood her methods well enough to counter them. Every success, every network she had built, every relationship she had cultivated could have been compromised by people who possessed detailed knowledge of her activities and objectives. The response required strategies that went beyond conventional counterintelligence work. Khaemwaset couldn't simply identify and eliminate hostile agents, because the conspiracy involved people whose official positions made direct action politically impossible. She needed to find ways to neutralize the threat while avoiding the kind of dramatic confrontation that could destabilize the government institutions she was trying to protect. The solution came through an understanding of human psychology that demonstrated why she had become legendary throughout the ancient world. Rather than attempting to destroy the conspiracy through direct confrontation, she decided to manipulate its members into destroying themselves through their own ambitions and rivalries. The strategy began with carefully crafted intelligence about fictional opportunities that would be irresistible to ambitious conspirators. She arranged for false information to reach the hostile network about supposed weaknesses in Egyptian defenses that could be exploited for personal gain. The intelligence was designed to encourage actions that would expose the conspirators while serving Egyptian interests rather than threatening them. The first test came when she leaked information about a supposedly vulnerable gold shipment traveling from Nubian mines to Thebes. The intelligence suggested that the convoy would be lightly guarded due to administrative oversight, creating an opportunity for theft that could provide enormous personal wealth while weakening Egyptian military resources. The response confirmed her suspicions about the extent of the internal conspiracy. Within days of the false intelligence reaching the hostile network, she detected unusual activities around the convoy's planned route. Officials who had no legitimate reason to be in the area were suddenly making inspection tours, while military units were being repositioned in ways that couldn't be explained through normal operational requirements. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. The gold convoy was real, but it was protected by forces that the conspirators couldn't detect through their compromised intelligence sources. When the attack came, it revealed not only the identity of several key conspirators, but also the sophisticated communication methods they used to coordinate their activities. The evidence gathered during this operation provided Khaemwaset with detailed knowledge of the conspiracy's organization and objectives. The hostile network wasn't simply seeking personal enrichment through theft and corruption. They were working to systematically weaken Egyptian military and administrative capabilities, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by foreign enemies. The connection to the Sea Peoples became clear when interrogation of captured conspirators revealed that they had been receiving support and direction from agents operating out of Crete. The revolutionary ideology that attracted followers to Sea People communities had also found receptive audiences among Egyptian officials who felt constrained by traditional hierarchies and administrative procedures. But the conspiracy went deeper than simple ideological attraction. Intelligence analysis revealed that Sea People agents had been systematically recruiting Egyptian officials for years, offering them positions in the alternative civilization being built throughout the Mediterranean. The recruitment wasn't based on coercion or simple bribery, but on genuine appeals to people who sought greater opportunities and freedoms than traditional Egyptian society could provide. The discovery forced Khayemweset to confront fundamental questions about the society she had spent her life defending. If Egyptian officials were voluntarily betraying their homeland in favor of Sea People alternatives, it suggested that the reforms implemented after her Cretan expedition hadn't addressed all the underlying problems that made revolutionary ideologies attractive. The investigation expanded to examine the backgrounds and motivations of officials who had joined the conspiracy. The analysis revealed patterns that were both surprising and disturbing. Many of the conspirators were competent individuals who had been frustrated by limitations on advancement or recognition within traditional Egyptian institutions. They weren't criminals or traitors in the conventional sense, but people who had chosen what they saw as better alternatives to the opportunities available in their homeland. The realization led to a comprehensive review of Egyptian administrative practices that went beyond the military and diplomatic reforms implemented earlier. The investigation examined promotion procedures, recognition systems, and institutional cultures that might be driving talented individuals to seek opportunities elsewhere. The recommendations that emerged were revolutionary in their implications for Egyptian society. They proposed fundamental changes to administrative hierarchies that would create more opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than social connections. They suggested modifications to recognition systems that would acknowledge contributions from individuals regardless of their original social status. Most significantly, the proposals included provisions for creating entirely new institutions that would allow innovative individuals to pursue projects and ideas that might not fit within existing administrative structures. These changes would address the fundamental attractions of Sea People society while preserving the stability and continuity that had made Egyptian civilization successful. The implementation of these administrative reforms required political skill that demonstrated Ramesses' growing understanding of the challenges facing traditional civilizations. The changes faced resistance from established officials who saw their privileges being threatened, but they also generated enthusiasm among younger administrators who recognized opportunities that had previously been unavailable to them. The success of these internal reforms provided Egypt with advantages that extended beyond simple administrative efficiency. The new institutions attracted talented individuals who might otherwise have been recruited by hostile networks, while the reformed promotion procedures created loyalty among officials who saw genuine opportunities for advancement within Egyptian service. But the most significant impact was on intelligence operations themselves. The administrative changes allowed Khayemweset to recruit agents and analysts from backgrounds that had previously been excluded from government service. The expanded talent pool provided capabilities that enhanced every aspect of Egyptian intelligence work, from information gathering to strategic analysis. The transformation was demonstrated during the next major crisis, when intelligence reports indicated that a coalition of Sea People communities was planning coordinated attacks against multiple Mediterranean powers simultaneously. The scale of the planned operation exceeded anything previously attempted, involving naval forces that could threaten the survival of established civilizations throughout the region. The intelligence came through channels that hadn't existed before the administrative reforms. Agents recruited from merchant families provided information about unusual shipping activities, while analysts with military backgrounds recognized patterns in Sea People preparations that revealed their strategic objectives. The diversity of perspectives allowed Egyptian intelligence to develop a comprehensive understanding of the threat that would have been impossible under previous organizational structures. The response required coordination between established powers that demonstrated how completely the political landscape had changed since the early days of Sea People activities. The intelligence sharing networks that Khaemwaset had developed now operated with efficiency that allowed information to move across vast distances within days rather than weeks. Egyptian naval forces coordinated with Hittite and Persian fleets to establish defensive positions that could counter Sea People attacks while protecting critical trade routes. The cooperation extended beyond simple military coordination to include intelligence sharing that allowed each power to contribute its unique capabilities to the common defense. The decisive engagement took place in waters off the coast of Cyprus, where the combined fleets of established powers confronted the largest Sea People naval force ever assembled. The battle demonstrated both the military capabilities that traditional civilizations could achieve through cooperation and the continuing appeal of Sea People ideology, even defeat. The Sea People forces fought with dedication that impressed even their enemies, demonstrating the loyalty that their alternative social organization could inspire. But their defeat marked the end of their expansion throughout the Mediterranean, forcing them to consolidate in territories they already controlled, rather than continuing their campaign of revolutionary transformation. The victory provided established powers with security that allowed them to focus on internal development rather than external defense. The reforms that had been implemented to counter Sea People appeal could now be refined and expanded, creating forms of social organization that combine traditional stability with revolutionary opportunities for individual advancement. Khaemwaset found herself at the center of these developments, her intelligence networks providing the foundation for political changes that were reshaping the ancient world. The skills she had developed in palace intrigue and diplomatic negotiation had evolved into capabilities that could influence the fundamental structures of civilization itself. But the most remarkable aspect of her transformation was how it reflected broader changes in the role of women within ancient societies. The crisis created by Sea People activities had demonstrated that survival required the contributions of talented individuals, regardless of their gender or social background. The success of Khaemwaset's operations provided evidence that traditional limitations on women's participation in government and military affairs were counterproductive luxuries that established powers could no longer afford. The recognition led to institutional changes that went far beyond individual advancement opportunities. Egyptian administrative structures were modified to include formal positions for women in intelligence, diplomatic, and military planning roles. Similar changes were implemented by other powers that had witnessed the effectiveness of Egyptian innovations. The transformation extended beyond government service to include commercial and religious institutions that had traditionally excluded women from leadership positions. The skills that women had developed in managing household affairs and social relationships proved directly applicable to the complex challenges of managing large organizations and international relationships. The changes weren't implemented without resistance from traditional authorities who saw their privileges being threatened. But the military and political successes achieved through reformed institutions provided compelling arguments for continuing the transformation despite conservative opposition. The long-term impact of these changes would influence the development of Mediterranean civilizations for centuries. The integration of women into government and military institutions provided established powers with human resources that had previously been underutilized, while the merit-based advancement systems reduced the appeal of revolutionary alternatives that promised opportunities unavailable through traditional channels. Khaemwaset's career had become a symbol of possibilities that were reshaping ancient societies. Her rise from courtesan to intelligence chief demonstrated that traditional social hierarchies could be modified to recognize and utilize talent regardless of its origins. Her success provided inspiration for women throughout the Mediterranean world who sought opportunities that had previously been denied to them. But her most lasting contribution was the demonstration that intelligence work could go beyond simple information gathering to become a tool for social and political transformation. The networks she had built and the methods she had developed provided models that would influence intelligence operations throughout history. The techniques of analyzing social and political trends, identifying sources of instability, and developing strategies that addressed underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms became standard practices for intelligence services throughout the ancient world. The understanding that domestic reforms could be as important as military preparations in maintaining security became accepted wisdom among political leaders who had witnessed the effectiveness of Egyptian innovations. The legacy extended beyond specific techniques to include fundamental concepts about the relationship between intelligence work and governance. The recognition that information gathering and analysis could contribute to policy development rather than simply supporting existing decisions became a foundation principle for effective administration. The transformation of intelligence work from a tactical tool to a strategic capability reflected broader changes in how ancient civilizations understood the challenges they faced. The complexity of managing large, diverse populations in an interconnected world required information and analysis capabilities that exceeded what traditional administrative structures could provide. The institutions that Khayem-Wasset helped create became models for governments throughout the Mediterranean world. The combination of professional intelligence services with merit-based advancement systems provided established powers with advantages that helped them adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their essential characteristics. The success of these innovations demonstrated that traditional civilizations possessed remarkable capacity for adaptation when faced with existential challenges. The reforms implemented in response to Sea People activities create forms of social organization that were more flexible and inclusive than previous systems, while maintaining the stability and continuity that had made ancient civilizations successful. The story of the courtesans of Thebes had evolved into something far greater than individual tales of ambition and success. It had become a demonstration of how human societies could transform themselves in response to new challenges, while preserving the achievements that had taken millennia to develop. The women who had once operated in the shadows of power had become architects of changes that would influence the course of history. Their intelligence, creativity, and determination had proven that traditional limitations on human potential were artificial constraints that could be overcome through courage and skill. The networks they had built, the methods they had developed, and the institutions they had created provided foundations for political and social development that would continue long after their individual careers had ended. The ancient world had been transformed by women whose names were largely forgotten by history, but whose contributions shaped the development of civilization itself. The courtesan, who had once memorized religious texts to impress a nervous scribe, had become the creator of intelligence systems that protected empires and influenced the fate of nations. Her journey from the workers' quarter of Thebes to the centers of international power demonstrated possibilities that continued to inspire generations of women who sought to transcend the limitations imposed by traditional social structures. The hidden women behind the pharaohs had finally emerged from the shadows, their stories revealing the complex networks of influence and intelligence that had shaped one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Their legacy lived on in the institutions they had created, the methods they had developed, and the understanding they had provided about the true sources of political power in the ancient world. The transformation of ancient Egypt through the influence of these remarkable women created ripple effects that would reshape the Mediterranean world for generations. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of their legacy was how they fundamentally altered the very nature of power itself, from the visible displays moving a tonic authority to the subtle of foreign networks of influence that operated behind palace walls. As Khayem-Wasset consolidated her position as Egypt's most formidable intelligence operative, a new generation of women began emerging from the shadows of Thebes, each bringing their own unique skills to the complex game of international politics. These weren't mere imitators of her success, but innovators who understood that the changing world required entirely new approaches to the ancient arts of influence and persuasion. Among the most remarkable of these newcomers was Hatshepsut the Younger, a woman whose name honored the legendary female pharaoh, but whose methods were entirely her own creation. Unlike her predecessors, who had relied primarily on beauty and charm to gain access to power, Hatshepsut possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand and manipulate the complex economic forces that were reshaping the ancient world. Born into a family of grain merchants who supplied the massive temple complexes of Thebes, Hatshepsut had grown up observing how food distribution affected everything from religious festivals to military campaigns. She understood that controlling grain supplies meant controlling populations, and that understanding economic patterns could provide insights into political developments that conventional intelligence gathering might miss entirely. Her entry into the world of palace politics came during a crisis that tested every assumption about Egyptian economic stability. A series of poor harvests in the southern provinces had created shortages that threatened to destabilize the entire kingdom. Traditional responses focused on redistributing existing supplies and importing grain from allied territories, but these measures weren't sufficient to address the scale of the problem. Hatshepsut approached the crisis from an entirely different perspective. Rather than simply managing shortages, she proposed creating new agricultural systems that could prevent future famines while simultaneously strengthening Egypt's position relative to neighboring powers. Her plan required coordinating activities across multiple provinces and establishing relationships with foreign suppliers that went far beyond conventional trade agreements. The complexity of her proposal initially generated skepticism from established officials who questioned whether someone without formal training in government administration could understand the intricacies of managing an empire's food supply. But Hatshepsut possessed something that traditional administrators lacked: a comprehensive understanding of how economic relationships actually functioned at every level of society. Her presentation to the Royal Council was a masterpiece of strategic thinking that demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of many career officials. She explained how grain shortages in one region created opportunities for surplus producers in other areas, how transportation costs affected the viability of different supply sources, and how storage facilities could be used to manipulate prices and availability throughout the kingdom. But her most impressive insight was recognizing how food security connected to military and diplomatic capabilities. Armies required reliable supply lines that could function even during extended campaigns. Diplomatic negotiations were influenced by each party's ability to feed their population during periods of international tension. Economic relationships with foreign powers could be strengthened or weakened depending on how food trade was managed. The implementation of Hatshepsut's proposals required establishing networks that throughout extended Egypt and beyond its borders. She needed to coordinate with provincial administrators who had traditionally operated independently, negotiate with foreign suppliers who possessed their own political agendas, and establish transportation systems that could function reliably even during periods of political instability. The success of her economic initiatives provided Egypt with advantages that went far beyond simple food security. The new agricultural systems created surplus production that could be used to support larger armies and more extensive construction projects. The international trade relationships provided diplomatic leverage that enhanced Egypt's influence throughout the region. Most importantly, the economic stability reduced internal tensions that had previously made the kingdom vulnerable to foreign manipulation. But Hatshepsut's greatest achievement was demonstrating how economic intelligence could enhance traditional political and military analysis. Her networks of grain merchants, transportation coordinators, and storage facility managers provided information about regional conditions that complemented the intelligence gathered through conventional channels. The combination created a comprehensive understanding of Mediterranean affairs that exceeded what any single approach could achieve independently. The integration of economic and political intelligence required developing new methods for analyzing information that came from fundamentally different sources. Merchant reports about market conditions needed to be correlated with diplomatic communications about international negotiations. Transportation difficulties had to be evaluated alongside military intelligence about potential threats. Storage capacity calculations required consideration of political factors that might affect future supply requirements. The analytical framework that Hatshepsut developed became a model for intelligence services throughout the ancient world. Her understanding that economic patterns reflected underlying political trends provided insights that conventional analysis might miss. Her recognition that controlling economic relationships could influence political outcomes created new tools for achieving diplomatic objectives without resorting to military action. The success of these innovations attracted attention from foreign powers, who recognized that Egypt had developed capabilities that exceeded traditional approaches to international relations. Mesopotamian kingdoms began attempting to recruit Egyptian economic advisors, while Mediterranean trading cities sought to establish relationships that would provide access to Egyptian analytical methods. The competition for Egyptian expertise created opportunities that Hatshepsut used to expand her influence beyond Egypt's borders. She began establishing economic intelligence networks that operated throughout the Mediterranean world, providing information that benefited Egyptian interests, while demonstrating the value of her analytical approaches to foreign governments. These international activities required navigating political sensitivities that were even more complex than domestic operations. Hatshepsut had to provide valuable services to foreign powers while ensuring that her activities ultimately served Egyptian rather than foreign interests. She needed to maintain the trust while preserving the operational security that protected her sources and methods. The solution required developing what would later be recognized as one of history's first multinational consulting operations. Hatshepsut created a network of economic advisors who provided analytical services to multiple governments while maintaining ultimate loyalty to Egyptian interests. The arrangement allowed her to gather intelligence about foreign capabilities and intentions while providing services that enhanced Egypt's reputation for sophisticated analysis. The consulting network became a powerful tool for Egyptian diplomacy, as foreign governments that relied on Egyptian economic advice were naturally inclined to maintain positive relationships with the kingdom that provided such valuable services. The arrangement also created channels for communicating Egyptian perspectives and concerns to foreign decision-makers in ways that formal diplomatic communications couldn't achieve. But the most significant impact was on the development of international commerce itself. Hatshepsut's analytical methods provided merchants and traders with tools for understanding market conditions that exceeded anything previously available. Her insights into transportation costs, storage requirements, and regional supply patterns allowed commercial operations to achieve efficiency and profitability that transformed Mediterranean trade. The transformation of commercial relationships created new forms of international cooperation that complemented traditional diplomatic and military alliances. Merchants who benefited from Egyptian analytical services became informal ambassadors who promoted Egyptian interests while pursuing their own commercial objectives. Trading relationships created economic incentives for maintaining peaceful relations that reinforced formal peace agreements. The success of economic diplomacy demonstrated that commerce could be as important as military power in determining international relationships. Countries that could provide valuable commercial services gained influence that exceeded what their military capabilities alone would suggest. Economic relationships created dependencies that made military conflicts more costly and less likely to achieve lasting results. Hatshepsut's recognition of these dynamics led to the development of what would later be called economic statecraft. the systematic use of commercial relationships to achieve political objectives. Her methods provided alternatives to military action that could be more effective and less costly than traditional approaches to international competition. The integration of economic and political strategy required institutional changes that went beyond individual innovations to include fundamental modifications in how governments organize their decision-making processes. Economic advisors needed to be included in political planning, while diplomatic negotiations required consideration of commercial implications that might not be obvious to traditional foreign policy specialists. The institutional changes created new career paths for individuals whose backgrounds had previously excluded them from government service. Merchants, traders, and financial specialists found opportunities to contribute their expertise to national policy development. The expansion of government roles created positions for women whose commercial experience qualified them for responsibilities that had traditionally been reserved for men with military or diplomatic backgrounds. The transformation extended beyond individual opportunities to include fundamental changes in how societies understood the relationship between commercial and political activities. Economic success became recognized as a component of national security that required the same level of attention and resources traditionally devoted to military preparations. The recognition led to the establishment of economic intelligence services that operated alongside traditional military and diplomatic intelligence organizations. These new institutions provided analysis of commercial trends, assessment of foreign economic capabilities, and evaluation of how economic policies might affect international relationships. The development of economic intelligence created new requirements for analytical skills that combined commercial expertise with political understanding. Analysts needed to understand both market dynamics and diplomatic protocols, while field operatives required knowledge of both business practices and intelligence gathering techniques. The complexity of these requirements led to the establishment of training programs that prepared individuals for careers in economic intelligence. These programs drew students from diverse backgrounds, including many women whose commercial experience made them particularly well suited for the analytical and operational challenges of economic intelligence work. The success of these training programs demonstrated that intelligence capabilities could be systematically developed rather than simply relying on individuals with natural talents for the work. The institutional approach to developing intelligence professionals created more reliable and consistent capabilities that enhanced national security while providing career opportunities for talented individuals regardless of their social backgrounds. The transformation of intelligence work from individual expertise to institutional capability represented a fundamental shift in how ancient civilizations approached the challenges of governance and security. The recognition that intelligence required systematic development and institutional support created foundations for more effective government that would influence political development for centuries. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these changes was how they reflected the growing influence of women in activities that had traditionally been dominated by men. The success of Khaemwaset, Hatshepsut, and their colleagues provided evidence that excluding women from government and military roles was a waste of human resources that established powers could no longer afford. The recognition led to systematic examination of other areas where traditional limitations might be preventing societies from utilizing available talents effectively. Military organizations began experimenting with roles for women in logistics, communications, and intelligence activities. Religious institutions started recognizing women's contributions to theological scholarship and administrative management. Commercial organizations discovered that women's skills in managing household resources translated directly to capabilities needed for managing large commercial enterprises. The recognition created opportunities for women in banking, international trade, and industrial management that had previously been unavailable to them. The expansion of opportunities for women created social changes that went far beyond individual advancement to include fundamental modifications in family structures and community relationships. Women who possessed independent economic resources could make choices about marriage and family life that had previously been determined by economic necessity rather than personal preference. The changes created new forms of family organization that combined traditional responsibilities with expanded opportunities for both men and women. Couples could negotiate relationships based on complementary capabilities rather than rigid gender roles that might not reflect their individual talents and interests. The transformation of family relationships had implications for child-rearing practices that influenced the development of future generations. Children who observed both parents contributing to family welfare through diverse activities developed more flexible attitudes about gender roles and career possibilities. The long-term impact of these social changes would be felt throughout Mediterranean civilizations for centuries. The recognition that women could contribute effectively to activities traditionally dominated by men created precedents that influenced political and social development long after the specific crises that had originally created these opportunities had been resolved. The legacy of the courtesans of Thebes extended beyond their individual achievements to include fundamental changes in how ancient societies understood human potential and social organization. Their success demonstrated that traditional limitations were artificial constraints that could be overcome through necessity, creativity, and determination. The networks they had built, the methods they had developed, and the institutions they had created provided models for social and political innovation that would influence human development for millennia. The women who had once been hidden behind pharaohs had become architects of changes that would reshape civilization itself. Their story revealed how individual excellence could catalyze social transformation when the circumstances created opportunities for challenging established practices. The combination of personal ambition with genuine service to broader social interests demonstrated how individual advancement could contribute to collective progress, rather than simply benefiting single individuals at the expense of community welfare. The understanding that emerged from their experiences provided insights into the relationship between individual opportunity and social stability that would influence political thinking throughout history. The recognition that societies could benefit from expanding opportunities for all members, rather than restricting advancement to traditional elites, became a foundation principle for more effective and equitable forms of government. The courtesans of Thebes had proven that hidden influence could become visible power when circumstances required societies to recognize and utilize all available talents. Their transformation from palace entertainers to government officials demonstrated possibilities that continued to inspire social reformers who sought to create more inclusive and effective forms of human organization. The ancient world had been forever changed by women whose intelligence, creativity, and determination had overcome barriers that had seemed insurmountable. Their legacy lived on in the institutions they had created, the methods they had pioneered, and the understanding they had provided about the true nature of human potential and social possibility. The hidden women behind the pharaohs had finally claimed their rightful place in history, not as footnotes to male achievement, but as architects of the complex systems of governance and intelligence that had made ancient Egyptian civilization one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. Their stories revealed the sophisticated networks of influence and capability that had operated behind the scenes of official history, shaping events and policies in ways that traditional accounts had never acknowledged. Their success proved that the real power in ancient Egypt had never resided solely in the golden throne rooms and temple sanctuaries, where pharaohs performed their ceremonial duties. It had been created and maintained by networks of intelligent, determined individuals who understood that lasting influence required more than temporary access to authority. It demanded the patient construction of relationships, the careful analysis of information, and the strategic application of knowledge that could shape decisions and events across generations. The courtesans of Thebes had mastered these subtle arts of power, transforming themselves from entertainers into advisors, from companions into intelligence chiefs, from shadows into shapers of history itself. Their legacy would endure long after the pyramids had been built and the pharaohs had been forgotten, living on in the understanding that true power, belonged to those who possessed the intelligence to gather information, the wisdom to analyze it effectively, and the skill to apply it in ways that could change the world. This extraordinary career came culmination of Kaimuset, not through a single dramatic moment, but through a subtle shift that would redefine the very foundations of ancient Egyptian power. As the reforms she had championed took root throughout the kingdom, a new generation of women began emerging from every corner of Egyptian society, each bringing skills that had been overlooked for centuries. In the artisan quarters of Memphis, a bronze worker's daughter named Nefret had been quietly developing innovations in metallurgy that would revolutionize Egyptian weapons manufacturing. Her understanding of alloy compositions and heating techniques exceeded that of the royal armorsmiths, but her gender had prevented her from gaining recognition for her contributions. The new institutional structures created pathways for her expertise to reach military planners who desperately needed technological advantages over foreign enemies. Nefret's journey to prominence began when Egyptian forces reported that enemy weapons were consistently outperforming their own equipment. Traditional approaches to solving this problem involved recruiting foreign craftsmen or attempting to capture superior weapons for analysis. But Nefret proposed something entirely different: systematic experimentation with new materials and techniques that could create weapons superior to anything currently available. Her workshop became a center of innovation that attracted the attention of military commanders who had initially been skeptical about accepting advice from someone outside established hierarchies. But when her experimental weapons demonstrated capabilities that exceeded foreign equipment, resistance to her participation quickly disappeared. The success created precedents that opened military planning to expertise from sources that had previously been ignored. Meanwhile, in the temple schools of Karnak, a young woman named Iset had been developing mathematical concepts that would transform Egyptian engineering and construction techniques. Her calculations allowed architects to design structures that used materials more efficiently while achieving greater stability and durability than traditional methods could provide. The innovations had obvious applications for military fortifications and public works projects that required maximum effectiveness from limited resources. Iset's mathematical insights came from observing patterns in natural phenomena that traditional education had overlooked. Her analysis of how water flowed around obstacles led to improvements in canal design that increased agricultural productivity. Her study of how weight distributed through different structural arrangements resulted in building techniques that could create larger spaces using less material. The practical applications of her theoretical work attracted attention from officials responsible for managing Egypt's extensive construction projects. The new institutional structures provided channels for her ideas to reach decision-makers who could authorize the resources needed to test her innovations. The success of these experiments created additional opportunities for women whose analytical skills had previously been underutilized. In the merchant districts of Alexandria, twin sisters named Bakht and Bakhet had developed trading strategies that were generating profits far exceeding those achieved through conventional methods. Their approach combined detailed analysis of regional supply patterns with sophisticated understanding of how political developments affected commercial relationships. The combination allowed them to anticipate market changes that caught traditional merchants by surprise. Their success came from recognizing connections that others missed between seemingly unrelated events. Political tensions in one region created opportunities for alternative supply sources that could be developed before competitors recognized the potential. Military campaigns affected transportation costs in ways that could be predicted and exploited by merchants who understood logistics as well as commerce. The twins' analytical methods attracted attention from government officials who needed better information about economic conditions throughout the Mediterranean world. Their networks of commercial contacts provided intelligence about regional developments that complemented information gathered through traditional diplomatic and military channels. The integration created more comprehensive understanding of international affairs that enhanced Egyptian decision-making capabilities. These individual success stories represented broader transformations that were reshaping Egyptian society at every level. The institutional changes that had begun with intelligence and administrative reforms were creating opportunities throughout the kingdom for people whose talents had previously been overlooked or undervalued. The expansion of possibilities was generating innovations that strengthened Egyptian capabilities, while demonstrating the benefits of more inclusive approaches to utilizing human resources. But perhaps the most remarkable development was how these changes were influencing the education and development of future generations. Young women throughout Egypt were observing the success of their predecessors and developing ambitions that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. They were pursuing knowledge and skills that would prepare them for roles in government, military service, commerce, and scholarship that had traditionally been reserved for men. The educational institutions that had been modified to train intelligence professionals were expanding their programs to include instruction in engineering, mathematics, military strategy, and diplomatic analysis. These programs were attracting students from diverse backgrounds who brought different perspectives and experiences that enriched the learning environment for everyone involved. The diversity of student backgrounds was creating new forms of collaboration that generated innovations beyond what homogeneous groups could achieve. Students with commercial experience worked with those who had military training to develop solutions that combined business efficiency with strategic effectiveness. Individuals with artistic backgrounds contributed creative approaches to problems that conventional analysis might not resolve. The collaborative methods developed in these educational settings were being applied throughout Egyptian institutions, creating more effective approaches to complex challenges that required multiple types of expertise. Military planning began incorporating economic analysis, while commercial ventures included strategic considerations that enhanced their long-term viability. The integration of different forms of expertise was generating capabilities that exceeded what specialized approaches could achieve independently. Egyptian forces were developing tactics that combined military effectiveness with economic efficiency, while diplomatic negotiations incorporated commercial considerations that created more sustainable agreements. The comprehensive approach to problem-solving was providing Egypt with advantages that foreign powers struggled to match. Traditional approaches that separated military, diplomatic, and commercial activities were proving less effective than integrated strategies that coordinated all available resources toward common objectives. The recognition of these advantages was encouraging other Mediterranean powers to experiment with similar reforms, but their efforts faced resistance from established elites who saw their privileges being threatened. The competition between traditional and reformed approaches to governance was creating new forms of international rivalry that went beyond simple military or commercial competition. Egypt's success with institutional reform was attracting talented individuals from throughout the Mediterranean world who sought opportunities that weren't available in their homelands. The immigration was providing Egypt with additional human resources while weakening foreign powers that were losing their most capable citizens to Egyptian opportunities. The brain drain was creating strategic advantages that reinforced Egypt's position as the region's dominant power. Foreign governments were beginning to recognize that restricting opportunities for their own citizens was creating vulnerabilities that their enemies could exploit. The realization was generating pressure for reforms that might reduce the appeal of Egyptian alternatives. The competition for talent was encouraging innovation throughout the Mediterranean world as different powers experimented with various approaches to attracting and retaining capable individuals. The rivalry was accelerating social and political development in ways that benefited populations throughout the region, even as it created new forms of international tension. The changes that had begun with the courtesans of Thebes had evolved into transformations that were reshaping the entire ancient world. The understanding that human potential could be developed and utilized more effectively through inclusive institutions was influencing political development throughout Mediterranean civilizations. The legacy of Khemwaset and her colleagues was becoming visible in the achievements of countless individuals who had benefited from the opportunities created through their innovations. The networks they had built were continuing to operate and expand, providing foundations for continued social and political development that would influence history for centuries. The story of hidden women behind the pharaohs had become a demonstration of how individual excellence could catalyze social transformation when circumstances created opportunities for challenging established limitations. Their success proved that societies could benefit enormously from recognizing and utilizing talents that traditional structures had overlooked or suppressed. The ancient world had been forever changed by women whose intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking had overcome barriers that had seemed insurmountable. Their achievements provided models for future generations who would continue the work of creating more effective and inclusive forms of human organization. The transformation continued to unfold as new challenges created additional opportunities for innovation and adaptation. The institutions that had been created to address specific crises were proving flexible enough to evolve in response to changing circumstances, demonstrating that successful reforms could provide foundations for continued development rather than simply solving immediate problems. The courtesans of Thebes had proven that true power resided not in ceremonial authority, but in the ability to gather information, analyze it effectively, and apply insights in ways that could influence events and shape the future. Their legacy lived on in the understanding that intelligence, creativity, and determination could overcome any obstacle when combined with opportunities to demonstrate their value. The hidden women behind the pharaohs had finally claimed their rightful place as architects of one of history's most remarkable civilizations, their stories revealing the sophisticated networks of influence and capability that had operated behind the scenes of official history. Their success demonstrated that the real power in ancient Egypt had belonged to those who possessed the knowledge and skills needed to navigate complex challenges and create lasting solutions. Their transformation from shadows into shapers of history provided inspiration for countless individuals who would continue their work of expanding human possibilities and creating more effective forms of social organization. The ancient world had been enriched by their contributions, and their legacy would continue to influence human development for generations yet to come. The courtesans of Thebes had written themselves into history not through conquest or construction, but through the patient work of building systems and relationships that could adapt and endure through changing circumstances. Their greatest achievement was demonstrating that lasting influence came not from temporary access to authority, but from the sustained application of intelligence and skill in service of goals that transcended individual ambition. Their story revealed that the most powerful force in human history had always been the capacity for learning, adaptation, and innovation that allowed societies to respond effectively to new challenges while preserving the achievements of previous generations. The women who had once entertained pharaohs had become the architects of systems that would outlast the pyramid themselves, their influence extending far beyond the borders of ancient Egypt to shape the development of human civilization throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The culmination of this extraordinary network came during what historians would later call the Silent Revolution, a transformation so gradual and complete that even those living through it barely recognized its magnitude. While pharaohs continued their ceremonial duties and priests maintained their ancient rituals, the real governance of Egypt had quietly shifted to institutions created and managed by women whose names appeared in no official records. The final test of this shadow administration came when Egypt faced its greatest existential threat since the unification of the kingdoms. A confederation of northern peoples, driven by climate changes that had devastated their homelands, began moving south in numbers that dwarfed anything the sea peoples had attempted. These weren't raiders seeking temporary plunder, but entire for new populations searching lands to settle permanently. The crisis demanded responses that exceeded the capabilities of any traditional structure government. Military preparations required coordinating resources from dozens of provinces, while maintaining agricultural production that could feed both armies and civilian populations. Diplomatic negotiations needed to address the concerns of multiple foreign groups while protecting Egyptian territorial integrity. Economic policies had to balance immediate defense spending with long-term investments in infrastructure and development. Khayyam Wasset, now recognized as the unofficial coordinator of Egyptian intelligence services, found herself managing operations that involved every aspect of government administration. Her networks provided information about enemy capabilities and intentions, while her reformed institutions implemented policies that had been developed through collaborative analysis involving expertise from throughout Egyptian society. The response demonstrated how completely the nature of power had been transformed. Instead of relying on pharaonic authority to compel obedience, the shadow administration achieved coordination through shared understanding of objectives and methods. Officials throughout the kingdom implemented complex policies because they understood how their individual contributions supported broader strategic goals, not because they feared punishment for disobedience. The military preparations revealed the extent to which Egyptian capabilities had been enhanced through inclusive approaches to utilizing human resources. Women served in logistics roles that ensured armies remained supplied during extended campaigns. Female analysts provided intelligence assessments that guided tactical decisions. Women with commercial experience managed procurement operations that acquired necessary equipment at costs that preserved resources for other priorities. The economic mobilization demonstrated innovations that exceeded anything achieved by traditional administrative methods. Hatshepsut's networks coordinated agricultural production throughout the kingdom, ensuring that military requirements didn't create civilian shortages that could undermine popular support for defensive efforts. Her analytical methods allowed officials to predict resource needs with accuracy that prevented both waste and shortfalls. The diplomatic initiatives showed how completely international relationships had been transformed through Egyptian innovations. Instead of formal negotiations between royal representatives, the discussions involved networks of specialists who could address technical concerns while maintaining focus on broader strategic objectives. The approaches achieved agreements that satisfied practical needs while preserving political relationships that would remain valuable after immediate crises had been resolved. The Northern Confederation's response to Egyptian preparations revealed that traditional military approaches were becoming obsolete in conflicts that involved entire populations rather than professional armies. The invaders possessed knowledge of Egyptian capabilities that suggested systematic intelligence gathering over extended periods. Their tactics reflected understanding of Egyptian weaknesses that indicated sophisticated analysis of previous conflicts and defensive measures. But the northern peoples hadn't anticipated the extent to which Egyptian society had been transformed through reforms implemented over the previous decades. Their intelligence was based on observations of traditional governmental structures that no longer reflected how Egyptian decision-making actually functioned. Their strategies assumed responses that would have been appropriate against conventional kingdoms, but were inadequate for dealing with reformed institutions that could adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. The decisive confrontation took place not on a battlefield, but in a series of negotiations that demonstrated the full sophistication of Egyptian diplomatic capabilities. Instead of demanding unconditional withdrawal or threatening total warfare, Egyptian representatives offered alternatives that addressed the underlying causes of northern migration while protecting Egyptian interests. The proposals included territorial arrangements that provided northern peoples with lands that could support their populations while maintaining Egyptian control over strategically critical regions. Economic agreements created opportunities for northern craftsmen and traders to contribute their skills to Egyptian development projects while generating income that could support their communities. Most remarkably, the agreements included provisions for integrating northern peoples into Egyptian institutions in ways that utilized their capabilities while ensuring their loyalty to Egyptian interests. Military units incorporated northern warriors, whose fighting techniques complemented Egyptian tactical methods. Administrative positions were created for northern officials, whose experience with managing migrating populations provided valuable expertise for Egyptian territorial expansion. The success of these negotiations demonstrated that Egyptian innovations had created capabilities that exceeded simple military or economic advantages. The kingdom had developed approaches to conflict resolution that could address fundamental causes rather than simply managing immediate symptoms. The methods provided alternatives to warfare that could achieve more lasting results at lower costs than traditional approaches to international competition. The legacy of these remarkable women extended far beyond the golden age of their influence. Long after Khayemweset had passed into legend and Hatshepsut's economic networks had become standard practice throughout the Mediterranean, their true achievement became clear. They had proven that power did